Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Alaikum salam.
Alaikum assalam.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that personally, I am situated, myself and Sister Sawsan are situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. It is also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon it, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. The Kingston Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee roots, but there is also a significant Métis community, and there are First people from other nations across Turtle Island present here today. And as Muslims, we acknowledge the Creator, Al-Khaliq, who gave us the responsibility of being vicegerents, or khilafa, with the responsibility of caring for the land and all that depends upon it. So today I would like to welcome everybody from across the nation, hopefully from coast to coast to coast and beyond, to our national, it's actually our grand finale of Islamic History Month, which is our national youth panel on Young Black and Muslim, My Canadian Experience. I am going to step away and I would like to introduce our moderator and host for today, Sister Sabrina Zahor, who is coming to us from London in the UK, and we are very, very grateful that she is here today. So I will disappear and take it away, inshallah.
All right, salam alaikum. Thank you so much for the introduction, Mona. I would like to welcome everyone to our Young Black and Muslim panel discussion, where we have had an incredible month of events and activities to celebrate this year's Islamic History Month. And we are excited to close this month's celebration of joy and solidarity for Black and Indigenous communities with a fruitful discussion of Black Muslims' Canadian experience. We'd like to acknowledge that the conversation about being Black and Muslim in Canada cannot be separated from the land we're on that has a long history of colonization and occupation. We are grateful for the way this land has been stewarded for generations and recognize our duty as Muslims on this land involves striving for social and environmental justice in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. My name is Sabrina Zahor. I will be moderating today's panel, and I am thrilled to be part of this moving and very important conversation that reflects the contemporary issues faced by young Muslims today. I am not based in Canada, but that's been important in learning about experiences of Canada and contrasting them to the experiences that I've had from South Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, and here in the UK. I'm originally from Tanzania, and I'm very excited to host this panel. Joining us today is Mona Rahman from Kingston, who introduced us with a beautiful dua. We have a panel of young rock stars who come to us from Vancouver, Calgary, Kingston, and Montreal to share their experiences as first or second generation migrants in Canada. I will give each panelist some time to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about yourselves. Tell us where you are from and what you hope to accomplish in this discussion. Sawsan, let's start with you.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Sawsan Mohammed. I'm really thankful to be part of this discussion. I'm a first year Queen's student, hoping to get my degree in education in Kingston, Ontario. I'm really happy that Sister Mona managed to do the land acknowledgement. And I'm thankful to have grown up in Kingston, Ontario, and hope to foster meaningful relationships of respect. As well as within this conversation, I really want to challenge some of the stereotypes of Black people and Muslims in the collective Canadian consciousness. And finally, I want to acknowledge that earlier this month, a young Black man by the name of Anthony Oust died in Ontario, in the city of Ottawa, after a no-knock raid was issued by the Ottawa police. My thoughts go out to his family in these troubling times.
Asmaa, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Asmaa. I'm a fourth year at the University of British Columbia. I'm Somali from Somalia, but I was born, raised, and currently live on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, colonially known as Vancouver. And I'm very excited to share the space with everyone and to discuss how our experiences as Black Muslim Canadians are similar across the country, but also to nuance out the differences that are also there. Thank you.
Mowahib, you want to tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from?
Yes, of course. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mowahib Hassan. I'm Somali. I'm a first-year student in honors in political science at Concordia University of Montreal. I'm originally from Quebec City and I lived there all my life. What I really hope to accomplish in this discussion is to bring my input as a Black Muslim woman evolving in a Francophone society. I know that my experience is different of those coming from different provinces, and I believe that it needs to be further discussed. I'm really looking forward to exchange and learn from the experiences that Sawsan, Hagir, and Asmaa went through elsewhere in Canada.
All right, and last but definitely not least, Hagir, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Hagir Sel. They're way younger than I am, everybody else on this panel. I hail from the city of Calgary, Treaty 7 land, Mininas. I always pronounce it wrong, Mikanstansis, which means the land of where the two rivers meet. Today, I'm here to talk about just the experience, not just experiences, but the work that's being done, and then some of the conversations that need to be had in the community regarding Black Muslims and what that looks like. Also talking about how do we make safe spaces and make the masajid in areas that we are in a lot more inclusive for everybody. So I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. And you'll see that we have a graphic recorder, Tiara Jung, joining us for today's session. I'll let Tiara introduce herself in a little bit, but just to tell you a little bit about graphic recording, it's a way that we can easily capture and share the main ideas that come out of today's discussion with the broader audience. Tiara will be drawing in real time, and if there's anything that you feel needs to be captured or was missed, feel free to send them a quick message or let me know. Please don't take pictures of or share the graphic recording until it's finalized so we can make sure everything is captured. But once we share it through our Facebook and other channels, share it far and wide. So I'll welcome Tiara to introduce themselves and say a bit more about graphic recording. Tiara, hi.
Hello, my name is Tiara Jung, and I am joining you here from, well, the lands that care for me are the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, also known as Vancouver, BC. And my ancestry is Hawaiian, Chinese, Irish, and Kleble-Tene, as well as Tahitian. As a non-Muslim person, I'm very honored to be here as witness and to offer my gifts of drawing to this conversation. And I really hope that I can reflect some of the, just like insights and connections and stories that each of you share. And as Sabrina said, closer to the end of the session, there'll be an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about what I've heard and reflect back to you. And that's also an opportunity for you to let me know if things resonate or if you'd like to see them differently. So you might see me moving around off screen because my supplies are off screen, but just to let you know, I'm fully present and listening to the whole conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Tiara. It really is quite awesome that we get to have you and the graphic design with us. So just before we kick off, I'd like to cover a bit of housekeeping, and it's very short and brief. This event is taking place on Zoom and being live streamed to Facebook. So if you have questions, please share them in either the comment section of the Islamic History Month Canada Facebook stream or the Zoom chats function. And I think that's all I have to cover for now. And now that we've covered that, I just wanted to start and kick off by asking our panelists, how do you feel explaining yourself as Black and Muslim? And what has your experience been in the different cities that you're from? Asma, can we start with you? Are you okay?
Yeah.
Right. Mhm.
So I'm curious to see what other people have to say about this, because sometimes I feel like explaining often turns into a defending kind of conversation, which is sometimes very aggravating to have, because at the end of the day, like the existing at the intersection of Blackness and Muslimness is really nothing new, right? Because we know that the very first hijrah, so that's the migration that Muslims underwent from Mecca in like Saudi Arabia in like the 7th century, was to Abyssinia. So that's like a Black African country, right? And even some of the first converts to Islam were Muslim, like Bilal and Soda. And to take it even further back, to take it back like a couple thousand years, right? To be a Muslim, we understand it nowadays to be to practice Islam, and typically it's like you're Sunni, Shia, Sufi, that kind of thing. But if you look in the Quran, the term, the word Muslim, Prophet Ibrahim came up with that to describe people who submit to a higher power, like monotheists and all that. And so it's an identity, it's a faith practice that goes back a long time. In the Quran details stories of various Black Muslims. If we're going to take Muslim to be anyone who sort of believes in Allah, believes in one God. So like Black Muslims include Prophet Musa, Luqman, and so on. So I've heard Dr. Bilal, where I don't know if people are familiar with him, but he's an amazing scholar. And so he writes about the Quran even being like an African text in a way. So coming from that understanding, being Black and Muslim is very normal to me. It's like there is no dichotomy between Blackness and Muslimness. But then coming into contact with other people, sometimes you see that there's a distinction that exists for them, and that they will want to flatten one part of your identity in order to seemingly make way for the other. So for example, I'm Somali. Sometimes people are like, yeah, you're Somali, you're not really African or Black, you're Arab, and they think they're doing you a favor because they're like, that's the aspirational Muslim identity. So don't you want to be that? But I think that's a sort of false connection that is made there. So it's interesting. That's what I'll say. But it's also it's normal, I think. Like it's not like we're not like some weird other marginalized Muslim identity, or we're not the other. It's normal to be a Black Muslim. That's what I wanted to say.
Sawsan, is there any part of that you recognize, or do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I completely relate. A lot of the time, being Black and Muslim, I almost always have to explain my background. You know, sometimes I need to like defend my Blackness. Sometimes I need to defend my Muslimness, because people don't think that they can conjoin together. Even though Islam is a religion, it's just something that you believe. It's not your race. And especially because like the majority of Muslims in Canada and in the West are immigrants, you're going to see like a lot of people just associating race or otherness with Islam. And like I found that something that was interesting is that as soon as I started wearing the hijab, all of a sudden, oh, you're not Black anymore. You're obviously something else, because like you can't be Muslim and Black at the same time, which is very funny to me, just because like, you know, it's a religion. It's never been a race, and yeah, I definitely connect with Asmaa on a lot of her experiences regarding that. Sometimes people decide that they look to me whenever we talk about terrorism or anti-Black racism, and being like the only Black or Muslim person in the room, oftentimes, like even within the whole school, it was a little bit daunting, because it's always you being the person that like talks about it and needs to read up on all these topics so that you can represent yourself properly, and that so you're some sort of ambassador, which is a really hard thing to put on like a little kid. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And I can relate to feeling that you are always on some sort of defensive for either one of your identities. It's like we keep having to explain the fact that we are Black and we are Muslim. If you break down those binaries even more, then we are also African. And I do sympathize and I do relate to being very young, like, and realizing that I had to take on this role as some sort of ambassador of some sort. Hagir, do you want to add on to that at all before we move on?
Absolutely. I think it's quite, well, I agree with everything that's being said so far. And I also agree that my experience with it is like I immigrated here when I was 9 years old. So the idea of being Black is very brand new to me. When I moved here, I was just Hajir for the longest time. I was Sudanese and that was about it. And then coming here, a superimposed identity, it took me a while to accept the fact that I was Black because it didn't make sense. I didn't comprehend it. And I think from what the other two individuals, plus I think Mowahib spoke, I'm not sure. But what happens is what they said is it's okay to be more than one thing. And I think that's the idea. Whenever we talk about, do I explain that I am Black and Muslim? Not really. I think most of the time people with me personally, that my experience is I find that people are confused what to do with me. If there's going to be discriminatory behavior, it's easier to go after me for being Black than it is to go after me for being Muslim, because 100% they're sure I'm Black, but a lot of time like, are you Muslim or do you just have a head wrap on or what's going on? Your hair looks different every day. So they don't know what to do with me. So they're like, we're just going to go with Black up until we'll make sure that of everything else. So I think this is the area that we find ourselves in, especially as Black Muslims in the community, is that there's a societal idea of what we are as Black individuals. And then when we enter a community, we're all people of color. And we've heard this many, many times. But even within the sphere of people of color, we as Black people go down to the bottom of the totem pole. And it gets hard whenever you hear, لا فرق بين عربي ولا عجمي إلا بالتقوى, there's no difference between an Arab or a non-Arab. It's all about piety. And then you're seeing the cultural and traditional practices seep into that, racism, discriminatory behavior. So all of a sudden you're trying to understand where you fit in, and you're trying to figure out the difference between, finding the difference between religious practices and traditional practices mistaken as religious practices. It gets very complicated, but yeah, so that's where I find myself. Thank you.
Mowahib, I know you might think I've forgotten about you, but I haven't. So do you want to add on to this question as well, Mama?
Yes, thank you very much to the other girls for saying something that was really important. And I just wanted to add to that with my personal experience. Like, I'm someone who's relatively shy, and I think I was conditioned to not take too many space in conversations as someone who's Black, a woman, and also as a Muslim. And so defending and explaining my faith and my race to others was very difficult. But with time, I realized my identity itself is political, and that if I do not speak for myself or my peers, others will. And personally, when you look different from other Quebecers, you know that you will already struggle to justify your ability to integrate yourself within the Quebec society. So when you're Muslim, the task just gets even much more harder. And you will be constantly reminded that you're a second-class citizen, no matter how well you're integrated. Like, as a proof, I was born and I was raised here. I went to school here. I work here. I'm proud of speaking French, but if I'm asked about my identity, then my attachment to the province will be disregarded strictly because of my faith and my race. And as I said earlier, I'm from Quebec City, but I did notice a big difference when I moved to Montreal, as people had different attitudes and less hatred towards me because of what I looked like.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Mowahib. Thank you all for sharing. And we've talked a bit about how other people see us. And one of the key identifiers of being a Muslim woman is obviously wearing the hijab. I guess that's the most obvious way that people would pick out that this woman is a Muslim, unless they confuse it with a turban, of course, or some sort of head wrap. But just from looking at this panel, you can see that some of us choose to wear the hijab while some others don't. I personally have gone through different periods in my life where I have chosen to wear the hijab, or some days when I haven't. Some days I choose to, some days I don't. But I'm really curious to know, how has wearing or not wearing the hijab shaped the way you own your own identity, and how has the way people react to your choice make you feel? Sawsan, I'd like to start with you first, if that's cool.
Cool. So wearing the hijab, when I first started wearing it, was kind of a no-brainer. There was no transition period. I just thought, like, this is what's gonna make me feel comfortable. This is how I'm going to like promise myself to, follow my beliefs. But later on, it kind of became a risk-benefit analysis. Not long after, in middle school, my friend was assaulted for wearing the hijab, and that kind of took a toll on my self-esteem. And then on top of that, I've been in some scary instances just because I am so visibly Muslim. And like, in addition, people would stare at me on the bus, or like I'd be walking downtown, people would stare at me. For a while, like, Kingston didn't really have a big Muslim population. It still doesn't. But when I was younger, I was often like the only Muslim in like the entire school with me and my siblings. So it was like alienating, because all of a sudden, there's another thing on top of me that people are just going to make assumptions about within conversation. Like, people will say to me like, oh, you're in Canada, you don't have to wear that anymore. And I've always been in Canada. And it really isn't, to me, a symbol of oppression, even though for some people who aren't really familiar with it, it is. And, on top of that, like, people were seeing me as more of an immigrant, even though I've been here my entire life. So people would talk down to me, they'd talk slow, they'd say like, oh, I don't know how you do it where you're from, but like in Kingston, we do it this way. And like, it was so awkward, because I'd have to explain, like, I was born a couple blocks away from here. Like, I've always been in Kingston, and I already know what Kingston's like. In fact, like, I've probably been in Kingston longer than you have. So yeah, it was definitely a risk-benefit analysis. And at the end of the day, I realized, like, you can't take that away from me. It's my faith. It's part of my identity now.
And Sawsan, how old were you when you transitioned into wearing the hijab? Do you remember?
So it was the 7th grade. I think I was like 12, around that age. Yeah, it's kind of something that, like, I thought that I would do. And I hadn't really thought that there was gonna be that much of a different reaction from people that, like, I had known for my entire life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember when I was in, I guess in Canada you'd call it middle school, when I wore the hijab. I just decided to wear it prior to Ramadan. And I felt as though everyone was watching me and they were going to be finding who I was. And that transition was almost an alienating experience, just because of how other people reacted. Now I'm older, it's just a choice that I make. But I wonder, Asmaa, if this was something like, do you remember when you first transitioned to wearing the hijab and how you felt?
So I actually went to a Muslim elementary school, and so we were all Muslim and we all wore hijab, like all the girls, as part of our uniform. And then I transitioned to a public high school, and I was like the only Black person in my grade. I was also the one of 2 girls wearing hijab in my grade, so it's very weird and ostracizing. And suddenly, like, I totally agree with what you said. It feels like everyone is staring at you. Everyone's like, why is she wearing that? They're imbuing it with a certain like political meaning, like Sawsan was saying, like sometimes for them it'll surface like stereotypes of being like uber submissive or very like super conservative. or having a certain political ideology. So it opens you up to hate sometimes, to scrutiny, to interesting questions.
Mm-hmm. Kind of
So yeah.
breaking up there, Asmaa, towards the end.
Oh, I'm sorry. My internet connection is not the best. Is it all right now?
Yeah, it's all right now. Thanks for sharing.
Okay.
Hagir, do you want to add to that?
Most definitely. I think my experience with wearing the hijab was, again, moved to Canada. I went to Islamic school, so we're all Muslim. We're all working together in this. And then my experience was when I went to school. My brothers and I were the only Black kids in the Islamic school that we went to, and I got comments about my hair. People would touch it when we go pray in the masjid. If I grabbed the hijab, the other kids wouldn't get it. So I decided I'm going to bring my own hijab from home and I'm going to put it on. It wasn't like I'm going to put on the hijab because I completely understand what the hijab means. I just put it on out of convenience because it just made my life easier because the other kids weren't so nice. And when it was Islamic school, we're all Muslim in the school together. And so I've put it on since I was 9, right? To my mom's dismay. My mom was like, you don't understand what's going on. Please don't put it on. Like, you have to comprehend what it is. It's a huge commitment. My dad's response was like, is this what you want? And then that's about that's about the whole conversation I had with him on that. He was kind of like, if you want to do this, go ahead. And my mom was like, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think you understand what's going on and what you're doing with this. So I've had it on since I was 9. It took me years. When I got older, that's when I found out that, the reasons why I keep it on, why I continue to keep it on, and why I like it and why I wear it. But it took a long time for me to understand like the actual religious aspects of why the hijab is worn and why you keep it. It's become an identity piece for me before it became a religious piece, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. So it was more part of like, you met Hagir with this is who I am. I have friends who tell me, if you walk in the room one day and you don't have it on, I don't know what to do with you because I don't think it's you, right? Like it's part of who I am continuously. So I built my religious identity after my own personal identity with it. So I don't know, like I would love to be like, you know what, guys, the experience is different and stuff like that. I don't know, because it's something that I've experienced since I've come here. But I do notice people speak louder to me. So several times I've had to tell people, I'm not deaf. I 100% hear you. Or they'll speak slower. I've been told by someone that I have an immigrant face. It looks like I don't speak English. And so they'll speak really slow, and I'm a procrastinator. So I let them. I'm like, go ahead. You're taking more time, which means I have less time to do what you want me to do. And I have to spend as much time with it as possible. So yeah, so my experience has been that I built my identity around my hijab, and then I built my religious understanding and the reasoning of why I keep it on, or, battling to take it off or whatever. So it was a different one for me.
Now, Mowahib, I know that I think it's just me and you on the panel who make the choice of not wearing the hijab. I personally choose not to wear the hijab, but I don't think it takes away from my faith or how I internalize Islam or how I identify as a Muslim. I wear a hijab in prayer and when I recite the Quran, but I have just made the choice not to wear it publicly. I've never felt that not doing so takes away from my identity or my faith as a Muslim. I'm just curious if you relate to me in any way here.
I do relate to you in many ways. I feel like I had many ups and downs with the hijab, but mainly because of the lack of tolerance where I live. I feel like maybe if I was living somewhere else, I would have been more confident in wearing it, in displaying my faith, even though right now I know that I can work on it without wearing it necessarily. But when I see the way hijabis are treated by the society in which I live in, it kind of makes it very hard. When I see just how my mother, my sister, or my friends who wear it are like easily victims of assault, or you receive insults just as they're walking in the street, then it gets even much harder. And even when I wear it just to go to the mosque, I see how people have different attitudes towards me. And inshallah, I'm going to wear it, as I said, but it's a work in progress. But what also I noticed is that the harder part for me is like feeling included within the Muslim community while I'm not wearing it. Like I oftentimes feel like I need to prove my faith twice as hard just because of my blackness, and people only see me as a Black woman until I wear the hijab. So on one hand, I feel like not wearing it is a barrier to my inclusion in the Muslim community in Quebec, but on the other hand, wearing a hijab is a barrier to my integration in Quebec. So it's sort of like finding a balance between the two of them and making a choice that is very hard for me.
You mentioned there that you see yourself transitioning into wearing a hijab later on. And I always say that I see it in my future, I see it happening. I don't see it now for myself, but it's nice to hear some sort of similarities across the board. Everyone else watching, please keep up with, bring in more comments, send us your questions. We've got some comments from Facebook. Alice Ahmed says, wow, keep it up, my dear friend. God bless you. Rubinia Siddiqui says, very well spoken. Hagir sending some love over, saying 100% agree. The hijab does not add or subtract from your Muslimhood. So let's keep those comments and questions coming. You can send them over in the Zoom chat or on our Facebook comments page. So one thing I found really interesting was Hagir and Asmaa spoke about going to Islamic schools, which even hearing that, I don't imagine this was the same experience in Quebec. I don't know enough. Do you have an Islamic school in Quebec?
There's one that opened only a few years ago, and it's only for primary school, and I was too old when it opened.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because you're all from different parts of Canada, and your experiences being Black and Muslim will differ depending on the community and the place that you're from. And I'm certain that you all face different challenges and are exposed to different forms of acceptance or othering. And Mowahib, I was just curious if you could just sort of elaborate on your experience being from Quebec and perhaps discuss how being from Quebec might differ from the other panelists who are from different regions.
So being Muslim and Black in Quebec is constantly a challenge. And first off, there has been an alarming rise in Islamophobia over the past few years in Quebec, and not only in Quebec City, but the entire province. And as a result, my local mosque was subject to an attack in January 2017. There's a man who entered the mosque and he killed 6 men and injured 19 others while they were praying Maghrib. So it was an event that shocked the entire Muslim community, and it sort of left us in a state of current fear. I personally knew someone who died during the event, and to see how poorly the situation was dealt with even years later shocks me to this day. Like right after the attack, the Muslim community shared its interest in having its own Muslim cemetery in Quebec City, because the closest one was in Montreal, which is still 2.5 hours from where we live. And we were hoping to have support from the citizens themselves, but many mayors opposed themselves to a Muslim cemetery because the population was against it. So there was a huge controversy linked to that, and it kind of left us shocked. After receiving so much empathy, we've noticed that we were still treated again as second-class citizens and not as important as others. And even more recently, there are 5 mosques in Montreal that have been vandalized in the span of the last 2 weeks only. And there hasn't been much media coverage or general outrage related to it, which kind of left us very anxious and conscious. Like, we're wondering if similar events as the one of January 2017 might happen again. And more recently, the Prime Minister, Mr. Legault, he passed a bill called Bill 21, which prohibits the display of religious symbols by public sector workers in the workplace. And it is a bill that is supported by approximately 63% of the population. So we can see that like the general public struggles to understand us and integrate us within the job market or even the Quebec society in general. And they have a hard time understanding that prohibiting Muslim women from teaching, for example, will just further marginalize them. And Muslim women are at the center of this debate mainly, but rarely had the chance to speak their mind. But I've spoken of my experience as a Muslim woman, but it's also important to point out the fact that our government does not recognize systemic racism and is having a hard time at recognizing anti-Black racism. So I do think that there are many layers to being Black and Muslim in Quebec. And I do think that there is a long fight that is awaiting us compared to the other provinces in Canada.
That's really heavy. And I remember briefly, like when we saw that in the news years ago. But this whole idea of like not being able to wear your faith or part of your identity in the public sphere, I personally feel and think that it's just a form of exclusion. It's a form of exclusion. There's been plenty of arguments for it with the secularization thesis. I still have yet to see any validity, but that's just my opinion. Perhaps Hagir, you'd like to share what you think about that and maybe tell us a bit about where you're from and how being a Muslim in Calgary might differ from Quebec.
I think the difference between Alberta and Quebec is that Quebec is it's very in your face with all the rules and regulations and the things that are happening, and Quebec is very open with what it thinks when it comes to secularism. But I think it also comes with like this for lack of a better term, French identity that they built on themselves as well, like this idea of what Frenchness is and this belief of a certain way. I think in Alberta, so speaking in Canada generally, I do a lot of work on anti-racism, anti-discrimination. And then generally the racism and discrimination that is, and Islamophobia in Canada, any discriminatory anything, is different than the United States because it's so much more insidious because it's so subtle, right? I like to say that Canada's racism is so vile, it's done with a smile. It makes you think there's something wrong with you and there's something about me that I need to change or fix. And so it's not the outward clear as day remarks like Quebec does. So Quebec, if we compare how Canadian discriminatory behavior, and Quebec is a lot more like the US than anything else. And so what happens is so here in Alberta, what you do face is that it's all done under this facade of we're trying to make you better, right? We're trying to help you out. And this idea of like, in Canada, we do things maybe a little bit differently. It's to be honest, we haven't faced like, maybe a couple of people from the Muslim community here, we haven't really faced like clear outright Islamophobia in the same way that in some parts like Ontario or Quebec have faced, right? It's not as bad. We've had a couple of people who would come around the masjid and put on a Facebook Live, videotape people going in and out of the masjid, and then just make up a whole bunch of things. Or they'll go to an Arab fest, because that tells you how knowledgeable they are about Islam. And they're like, they're all Muslim in the Arab fest. And you're like, Arabs and Muslims are not the same thing. And, it's not the same. And so what happens is that the experience here, being Muslim and being Black, it's confusing to most, but I think a lot of people want to know if there's something going on. But lately, we've seen a tide of intolerance come in, is because Alberta is very conservative, but also, I'm just gonna say it. If we talk about Alberta is extremely Americanized in the way that it functions politically as well. So they really love everything. Like some aspects of society here really love the way that Trump is speaking. And then so the incidences that do happen here in the community for us become a lot more difficult, is because you try to work with this cultural aspect of being polite, right? This underlining politeness, and then comes this undercurrent of all these practices that come into it. So a lot more systemic. I saw, Sawsan, you put in, police brutality and these things. These are issues we're going through all the time. I'm the chair of the African Advisory Board for the Calgary Police Service. And it's an issue, and it's an issue that we push all the time, that the police, we had this very interesting City Hall conversation in which the Calgary police chief was saying that we have systemic racism, but we had city councilors who are like, we don't believe that's true, go change the report. And so we sat there and I'm like, usually I'm doing all the yelling at the cops, being like, y'all are racist, but now the cop is saying he's racist and you're saying he's not. Like, I don't know. Every time we think we won, you get pushed all the way back again. So these are the issues that we do face. So as a Black community, a lot of the times is when it comes to racism against Black people, as Black Muslims, we're alone in the fight. A lot of my Muslims, some of my Muslim brothers and sisters who are not Black don't join the fight because they don't look at it as an ummah issue. I could talk about that a little bit more later, but it's one of these things that I talk about all the time. They're always like, well, it's not an ummah issue. What is going on? These guys, but you're Muslim, right? This idea is like, but you're Muslim. You're not Black though. And you're like, what? So it's one of these incidences. It's like, I'm always told to remember the issues that the ummah faces when it comes to many different things. But when I'm like, as Black people were being, the cops are being bad to us, they're like, well, they must have done something. Or it's not you. This has nothing to do with you. Or this is whatever over there, right? So trying to find your place within your own community, the conversation is very hard to have, but it needs to be had. Alberta, we're nowhere near Quebec, and I'm very glad and privileged to say that with us, happily and hopefully not, but we do face different things and nuances that come into play.
Asmaa said this. How is it different in Vancouver compared to both Alberta and Quebec?
I know in Vancouver, like when I'm in my Muslim crowds, my Black crowds, when we're talking about other places in Canada, there's a common refrain of, at least we're not in Alberta, at least we're not in Quebec. Those are sort of designated the more racist places. And I to an extent, I do think that's true. Like, I will acknowledge, like, being in the Pacific Northwest, there's sort of like this leftist hippie vibe, but that doesn't mean that things don't happen here. It might not be as extreme, it might not be as in your face, but certainly there are things that occur here as well. Like, various hijab wearing Muslim women have had their hijabs ripped off and had very awful things yelled at them out in public. We've had a couple Muslim institutes like vandalized. It doesn't happen as often as in Montreal, but it does occur occasionally. And also on the point of anti-Black racism, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in Vancouver, there was a historically Black community, so Hogan's Alley, where there was almost 1,000 Black residents in Vancouver back in the day. So that's pretty impressive now, but back then as well, when the city municipal population was even smaller. That's pretty cool. And then it was bulldozed in the 1970 in order to make way for a freeway. And so that displaced a lot of people. And so I feel like we can still feel that effect today because it's harder for the Black community to organize when your central location has been decimated by the government. And anti-Black racism, like, so many people have been called the N-word, like, regularly, like, and nothing's done about it. Like, there was a girl in high school who had a classmate, like a Black girl had a classmate make a video threatening her, saying he wanted to kill all Black people. And this was a high school where there was around 1,300 kids, only 6 were Black. And yet the school board and the police were like, he didn't really specify anyone, so we're not going to do anything. And it's a horrific experience, and there were no actual consequences faced by the people who were bullying and being racist and being so hateful. Instead, it was the Black students who were bearing the brunt of all of that. And she eventually transferred schools, and it's such a vile thing, and people act like that doesn't really happen in Vancouver. So there's a sort of like it doesn't happen here, we're not ever going to acknowledge it. And that's also a form of racism, right? So that's another way of making you feel excluded because the stuff that happens to you are seemingly not important, or they're seen as so rare that it's not even worth speaking about. And so yeah, it's you know, it's fair, you have to acknowledge that it's very different across the country. And so what we're dealing with is it's a little bit different, but I think it still hurts, and you still feel what happens to people in Ontario, Quebec, and so on. Like because like it's a community, right? Like we're still like a Black community across Canada, a Muslim community across Canada. Like when one part of the body is hurting, you still feel it even though you're so far away. So yeah.
And Sawsan, how does Kingston compare to what you've heard so far?
So I certainly say that I am coming from a place of privilege living in Ontario. I'm able to wear the hijab, and when I become a teacher, I'll still be able to wear the hijab when I am, you know, like employed by the government as a teacher. I think that Quebec and Ontario have very, very similar histories of slavery, racism, but it's a little bit less in your face. Something that I find is that, you know, there's a lot of complacency. As Asmaa said, there's not really that much done with instances of racism. So for example, like as I have mentioned, my friend got assaulted not that long after I started wearing the hijab, and the police followed up with the Muslim youth community, but the school didn't do anything. They didn't make sure that like kids felt safe. And I was like, as the only, well, I was one of 2 hijabis in my grade. And there was maybe, there really wasn't any conversations that sprouted out of that. And then on top of that, like minorities and people aren't really given a say in a lot of the laws that are passed. So I remember back in like 2017 and 2018, there was a police brutality bill that was going to be passed called the Safer Ontario Act. And what had happened is that there was only 4 months for people to decide on it. And on top of that, like it was a very controversial bill. Some aspects of it, yes, had been consulted about by minority groups. So for example, like the local Indigenous communities. But on top of that, like there were some aspects of the bill that could have like just privatized some of the police force, which is very problematic. And what had happened after that is when, you know, we got a conservative premier, Doug Ford. He limited the amount of time that people can, even though the bill had been voted on, he basically bulldozed through it. And on top of that, he limited the amount of time that people could inquire into the police to 120 days. So yeah, like despite the act being really controversial and being really concerning, there was very, very little input from Ontarian citizens regarding this bill and what the implications were. And it just got bulldozed it got bulldozed through by the in power Liberal Party. And there really wasn't any conversations about the repercussions. Well, there was, but people weren't given a say.
I know that we haven't spoken a lot about it, but Mowahib, Asmaa, and Sawsan, you're all university students and you're on campus. Hagir, I'm sure you've gone through the same experience. I just wanted to know a bit more about campus life being a Muslim, and do you think Canadian university experiences are inclusive and celebrate Muslim communities? I know you have the Muslim Students Association, and I just want to know if you think the experience is inclusive within the Muslim community on campus and with the university experience. Like, do you think they go hand in hand, or did you experience a distinct separation between the two? Let's start with Mowahib this time.
Thank you. I can't say much from my experience on campus itself, since it's my first year and I'm doing it online thanks to COVID. But I have noticed that the Muslim Student Association in universities have been doing a pretty good job at being inclusive and also very inclusive of the Black Muslims that were a part of it. As for the universities themselves, I feel like there is more work to do. I feel like most of the work is done by the students' associations rather than the institutions themselves. And I'm aware that many students groups, not only the Muslim Students Association, but others from the University of Montreal, Concordia, or McGill have been doing an amazing job at organizing events to condemn Bill 21 or just point out the Islamophobia in Quebec. But as I said, there's also work to do when it comes to ensuring that Muslims and other minority groups feel comfortable in class settings. And I believe that it is the main area that needs work if we really want to ensure that Muslims feel actually included and safe in those institutions.
I'm just gonna speak from my experience being on campus in the UK. Bear in mind, I did my bachelor's 10 years ago. But I also saw that the Muslim Association here was also kind of racialized towards, it was very much run and owned by the Pakistani community here. And I never asked why, and I wish I asked now why the East African Muslims never sort of joined or took initiative that same way. And somehow I felt that it fueled the racialization of Muslims on campus, but that was my experience here. It could have been that there were, perhaps we should have taken, as East African Muslim diaspora should have taken initiative in joining, or maybe we should have made ourselves more visible as well, or we should have acted in tandem with our fellow brothers and sisters. But I wonder if the experience is the same, Asmaa, on campus. Which university are you in again? Just remind us.
UBC, so
Yeah, right.
University of
Tell us a bit about
Columbia.
UBC's Muslim Association.
Okay. I've been talking about this with friends, so I'm not gonna try to rant, but it might turn into that. But the MSA, the Muslim Student Association at UBC, and like the other colleges and universities in the Metro Vancouver area are generally, like you said, like run by like the Pakistanis, like the South Asians, and like the Arabs, generally speaking. And yet there is a African Muslim community, but they're often feel like excluded, or you go there and people don't really want to talk to you the same, or you're not allowed to go for sort of the leadership positions and whatnot. So it's not as welcoming to you. So that's and then if it's not welcoming, well, you don't want to go. So then it's like, it continues to just be a space for the South Asian and like Arab Muslims.
I feel they were very welcoming. There was nothing.
Wait.
Yeah, I think it was all these binaries that we created ourselves in our head that separated us. Right, but I'm just curious to know, have you ever just decided to try?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
The trying part. Okay. So for example, so in like over the summer, the end of like the spring semester, we saw all the police brutality in the States. We saw all of that occur, and in a lot of MSAs in the Vancouver area and masajids as well, posting things like Black Lives Matter was a controversy. Like that's a debate. People were coming up with excuses to be like, that's too political for us to say. And so how does that make Black Muslims feel if something as simple as posting a hashtag, which is really not much, which is really not doing a whole lot, is too much of a burden, too much to ask for? And so what I've seen happening is a lot of Black Muslim students at these colleges and universities forming their own groups, because they're like, we're tired of being refused and not accepted. We're not having the whole of ourselves accepted. It's, if you want to come, we're not going to talk about issues facing Black Muslims. We're going to, like, I think it was Hagir saying like the Ummah. The Ummah means talking about Palestine, it means talking about Syria, but it doesn't mean talking about what's happening to, say, African Americans in the States, or just Black Americans or Black Canadians as well. That doesn't hit the same way. So yeah.
So Sawsan, you want to add to that or talk about any other experiences you had on campus?
Yeah, so like Mowahib, I don't really have too much experience on campus. I did grow up in Kingston, so I know a little bit about like the Muslim community there. I've been to a lot of MSA events, even though like I wasn't a student yet. And you know, like it is welcoming. Like my sister was the treasurer at a point, but at the same time, like it's kind of like a microcosm of the rest of the Muslim community. So like sometimes like, you know, you're at the mosque and someone will say like, oh, you're doing this wrong, even though like within your madhab or like there's oftentimes like almost looking down on traditionally like Black or African madhabs within mosques, or like just ways, you know, like ways of praying, ways of reading the Quran, even though they're they're supported by a lot of research, by a lot of notable scholars. The on top of that, like there's always these microaggressions where like people are like talking about darker skin and how it's not nice. But yeah, like the MSA at Queen's is super welcoming, and I think it's because we don't really have the luxury to discriminate, just because like Queen's is such a interesting university. I mean, we've made national headlines for having like racist parties, and like, you know, there's like a lot of mobilization of like far right students. There was this Facebook group related to Smith Business, Instagram page related to Smith Business that was posting racial memes, got put down, taken down. And then on top of that, like the administration before now had been very unwelcoming to minority students. Like there have been some initiatives, but there's a long way to go, just because like if you ever get the chance, look at the Instagram page called Stolen by Smith Business. It's just all the accounts of minority students within the Smith Business department at Queen's University, listing how they've been discriminated against, how Queen's doesn't really solve any of the sexual assault cases, how sometimes professors don't even look at people's you know, accessibility recommendations from their advocacy letters, even though they're obligated to. Maybe a kid doesn't get like the extra time that they need on the exam, and like that's all things that Queen's has been a perpetrator of. Recently, they've been trying to have like a more equitable admission practice, looking at like what is it called? Looking at like zip postal codes and making sure that like, you know, they're not discriminating against students based on race or income. But there's a long way to go. There's certainly a long way to go, especially when what I've heard from friends is that like when they go to talk to a professor, they're in like a group with some white friends, it's fine. But then when they're with like a majority Black students, the professor is very different towards them. They're very you know, like very what is it called? Very rude, actually.
Hagir, I know you and I have probably been bachelor's work a while back.
Yeah.
These ladies, but how was it back then for you compared
MSA?
to what you shared?
Yeah. So I think everybody, like, you know, there's this interest to join. To be completely and honest, I just joined the MSA like the Black Student Association, like the African Student Association, so I could be left alone. I couldn't. It was hard because every time they seemed to be like, you're Muslim, right? How come you're not joining? And I'm like, fine. And then, you know, at the beginning, I'm just like, please don't make me join anything. I don't know. And funny enough, the Black Student Association and the African Student Association was the same people. So I'm like, why am I paying to both of you? And they'll be like, well, I'm like, okay, cool. So, but for some time, you know, I tried to join, but again, I think it's the same thing that you talked about, Sabrina. It's like, it was predominantly held by, it was South Asian community and the Arab community are predominantly who held it. And I guess just our ways of practicing clash, it's just, it was a bit different. One of the major points is it's just, you know, one time there were conversations to be had, and we were discussing a definition of a word in the Quran, right? Like the word, it was the word kafir, which means non-believer. And then someone was like, the word kafir comes from the word to cover the truth. And I'm like, what? I'm like, it's not an English word that's Arabized. This has nothing to do with it. Like kafir means non-believer. And, you know, someone who covers the truth or tries to hide it is, you know, you've got the munafiqeen, you've got the people who are lying, those kind of things. And then so it became like, it was an argument, and then a statement was said by one of the MSA individuals, like, well, you're not in the ecclesiastical level that we are in. Your iman isn't that strong. This is why you're arguing. And I'm like, what does my iman have to do with the definition of a word and the fact that you're trying to make something happen? But this is something that normally happens, this idea of, no, you don't know the deen that way. And then when they find out I speak Arabic, I'm Sudanese descent. And so when they're like, when they find out I speak Arabic, it confuses them even more, because they're like, but you're Black though. What do you mean you speak Arabic? Hey, Sawsan. And then so what happens is they'll be like, what do you mean you speak Arabic? Like, this is not making sense. I'm looking at you. I see your mouth move. I have someone say this quote, I see your mouth move saying Arabic. I'm looking at you, and it's not, my brain is not connecting. Right. And I'm just like, we're in a halaqa. What does that have to do with anything we're talking about right now? I'm really like trying to remember Allah right now. So it does. So I think what happens is so my experience with the MSA was different. And to be honest, I wasn't really into it. It was just not my cup of tea, right? It was not something that I really wanted to get into. It's not something that I really enjoyed. It was just too intense for me sometimes. And so we had an event one time. I think the one time that I really got involved. So the MSA at UFC, I went to University of Calgary. So the MSA at University of Calgary and the MSA at Mount Royal College at the time, like they run differently. And for, you know, the theme was talking about Sayyidina Isa, so Jesus in Islam. And the MSA in MRU, which is now MRU, Mount Royal College, their posters were, you know, Jesus in Islam, garnered so much attention from everybody to join. For some reason, the MSA at the University of Calgary that year decided that their poster's going to be Jesus is a Muslim. And I remember I was walking down the hallway and I see the poster and I stopped and I kept reading it over and over. And I'm like, why? Like, what is this, right? The student contribution is $5. I felt so entitled at that moment. I'm like, I paid $5. Why is this happening? Like, who said yes to this? You're completely making everybody mad because nobody came in with an open mind. Everybody came in like, what? Because now, because I understand where they're coming from. This idea of like from Sayyidina Ibrahim, I think somebody mentioned it earlier and on, it's like, you know, they're all Muslim, but that's not how it's understood. It comes off very aggressive. And so I think that's the one time when I was like, you need to take all those posters down and do what MRC did, you know, write Jesus in Islam, because we want to have a conversation. I don't want to have a fight. What is this? I want my $5 back. If you guys are not changing this, and this is like at the end of the semester, so I'm probably milked my $5 by that time. But I think, but yeah.
What you're saying is so relatable. I remember feeling like my iman would be tested if I joined the group. So I was reluctant to join simply because I felt like they would test me. And I knew at that point I didn't know enough and I was still growing.
Mm-hmm.
I was still learning. So I probably just sort of use them for my own convenience in Ramadan. So I definitely pick up some dates, you know, some free Quran, some free books, you know, to use for Ramadan and Mawlid. But I didn't join just because I had fear of being told that my iman is not strong. And I remember back then I strongly identified as a Muslim, but I didn't know enough. Certainly not as much as I know now. Mm-hmm. I also felt from the few sermons that I had gone to that I don't think they're as open-minded. as the East African context is. Because for people who haven't been in East Africa or are not from East Africa, perhaps not so much Somalia, but when you come to Tanzania and maybe a bit of Sudan, we're pretty big mixing pot. Like we've got Christians, we've got Muslims, we live side by side. And our culture is a bit more laissez-faire compared to our brothers and sisters in other regions. So it was really hard to negotiate that. But Hagir, we're talking about the same experience here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
But
I think
the judgment that you would come from these Muslim union associations was intense for me. And being 18, it was even more difficult to deal with. It was just like, if I stay away, they'll leave me alone. So I remember that very clearly.
And it is, I don't want to use the word traumatizing lightly, but it's one of those things in which I just avoid, to be completely honest. I just constantly avoid it. It's just because it gets, like, as you said, it's very judgmental and it gets really intense sometimes. And sometimes they'll throw out a question and I'm like, why are you asking this question? Or a lot of the times, so the way that the University of Calgary functioned, I did 1 year in University of Western Ontario. And then I did 1 year and then I finished at the University of Calgary. And in Ontario, it's when you go to university, Ontario is a bit different. There's a lot more a mixing of people and just different areas and all that. In Alberta, there's cliques. Like in the University of Calgary, there's cliques. So even within the Muslim clique, you've got the South Asian clique, and then you've got the Black student clique, you've got this, and then you become friends. And after some time, everybody separates into their respective, whatever the clique may be. And then I found myself being like, I don't know where I belong. Like, I don't know what's going on. So I'm just going to sit here and hopefully someone would leave their own spaces because everybody's so separated. And they might not be politically conservative, but they're very much on a societal level. Everybody's very conservative within their own spaces and their own spheres. And I most definitely agree. There's a lot more laissez-faire kind of attitude with the dean that we have. Because I joked one time with somebody and I'm like, there's Islam that I know, I grew up with. And then I came here and there's Arab and like Indian Pakistani Islam, which I'm kind of a little bit confused about. There's a lot more strictness on what is expected of you. I learned that the hard way. There's a lot more, it's a lot more strict. There's a lot more rules to what a position of a woman is, where she should be, where I came from, it was just, you did what you did and you know what you know. And then you kind of like, everybody had a role to play. And when I came here, it was very clear where everybody needs to fit. And I was like, I don't get this. I come to Salli and all of a sudden I'm being told, there's this area that you come to Salli to come to pray. And then the separation, it's very clear. It's like, you have to be over there. And there's all these rules and regulations. And I'm like, I don't understand. You could talk to me, brother. It's okay. I'm not going to eat you. Like, it's nothing serious is going to happen. But I think it's very different. There's the cultural and traditional practices that came into play and how the deen is practiced. And it's just in the MSA, it confused me because that's not the household I came from. I came from a household in Sudan in which you've got all the madahib going on, right? You've got the Sufis and you've got what we call them the Ansar Sunnah, which are like the Sunnah guys who wear like their jalabiyah all the way at their calf and their beard is all the way to here, and the niqabis and the non-niqabis, the hijabi and the non-hijabi, the uber religious. You got all those, and we seem to live okay with each other. And then the judgment of like, here everybody's got to be in this certain pigeonhole. It made it difficult. So for me, I think in university, I just avoided it. I was like, no, I'm not doing this.
Well, I have to say this has been really interesting, but in the interest of time, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna move on to the next question. Please comment in our comment section on Facebook. Let's get some of those comments on those questions going. There's a discussion I did want to bring up, and especially when it comes to Black lives, this quote has been used over and over again, and I've heard it, but I also think it applies to being Muslim, and that is, they love everything about us, but they don't love us. And this really sparked something in me when I started seeing how Rumi was over sort of like fetishized on Instagram. Everyone's using Rumi. Beyonce named her daughter Rumi. Everyone, like, Rumi now is everywhere, but they've extracted all Islamic elements of who and what Rumi meant in the deen and where he came from. So it's taking and loving everything about this person except for the Islamic elements that were included. And it also happens with like architecture and how our Islamic history is glorified to a certain extent, but not for its Islamic identity. So how Morocco is sort of celebrated for its culture, everyone cherry picks the four wives thing in the Quran, but they're not going to talk about patience, you know, when they want to challenge a Muslim or Islam. Yet they want to call the Arab world or the Muslim world problematic, but they're all saving up to go and ball out their summers in Dubai, you know. And I just want to ask Asmaa, because I know you're a literature student here. But how do you guys feel when you feel as though everything about your history or the culture you come from is celebrated, but you aren't? Like, you can't be included in that celebration.
That's an interesting question, and it's a difficult like journey, like grappling with that, because it's so strange. Like, it reveals the hypocrisy and like contradiction that exists within that outside space that wants parts of you but not the rest of you. So I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but sometimes now I'm like, you know what, I don't even want your love, I don't want your acknowledgement. Just like, it's because it's so fickle, right? Because it's like it's a constant like passing like interest. Like, sometimes they really like the architecture and history, and like you said, sometimes it's like, no, look, it's so backwards and it's so messed up. So it's like, I feel like as a community, we shouldn't be so reliant on wanting that acceptance from this outside group, that we should really be focusing on shifting our perspective within our own enclosure to be like, well, we value this part of our history and we love this part of our art. And because obviously, like, we can come to hold that complexity and that nuance, whereas some folks are very slow to catch up and appreciate. But I think we need to make that emphasis to appreciate it ourselves.
And I think that part of the reason that, well, certainly from my experience, is that the outside perspective that doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand assumes that the Muslim world is a homogenous people or a homogenous society. That, and we've just touched on it, like, being an East African Muslim is very different from being, let's say, a Muslim from South Asia or a Muslim in the West. We're heterogeneous people, and the way we interpret, the way we look, or the way we practice, or how we internalize our faith is very different. Yet for some reason, what is celebrated or what is accepted is somehow out of the reach of our own ownership. Does that make sense? There's a very interesting thing now where there's a lot of funding going into Islamic scholarship, but not if it's an Islamic institution asking for the money. So if it's a university, for instance, or a department in the university asking for funding, it's sort of validated because it's not just owned by one identity. Like, Mowahib, how do you feel? Like, do you feel as though you're, like, being Muslim, it's selective based on other people's opinions or perspectives?
I feel like it is indeed very selective, the way they're using our culture and what we cherish, and they're capitalizing from it. And it's a weird thing to see them oppressing us and then picking and choosing what they want from our culture and our faith. Like, for example, just fasting was seen as something so shocking to them, and now you see everyone saying, oh, fasting, intermittent fasting is such a good thing for your health, Muslims have been doing it for centuries. So it's or just even henna. I remember the way I would get, like, I would be made fun of it just for wearing henna at school, and now I see all the white girls on Instagram or Vesco, whatever, just flexing their henna on me. It's so disturbing, and it's as if they only like us on their own terms. when it fits their narrative. And I think there's a similar approach when it comes to representing us on the news. Like they will tokenize Muslims and the Black community in debates that are concerning us. I've seen it for Bill 21. The media gave a voice to Muslim women who were against the hijab and fueled negative narrative about us. It's like they only choose to give us a voice when it fits their narrative, and they use people who do not represent the dominant opinion in the community, and it pushed the population to believe that we're sort of a monolithic group which share the exact same views on every single topic, which is far from being true.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mowahib. Hagir, can you just briefly touch up on that, like maybe a couple of minutes in the interest of time, sorry.
No, that's all right. That's perfect. What was the question again?
It's just a discussion of how they love it. You commented that they love us as an idea, not as a reality that would require change on their part. So maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I think this is the issue that comes with any minority group within a much larger group. And so what they do, they love us in pieces and they love us in parts. And they love the idea of us. They love the joy, they love the food, they love the color, they love the vibrancy, they love the parties. They just don't want you there. So they want everything that is except you. Don't bring you, all of you. That is your culture, your ideas, all the baggage that is you in it. And if you come in with the idea into any of these spaces, you have to come in with more of this like Western idea of what you're supposed to be, of what you're supposed to, how you're supposed to behave, yet they still want you to be cultural so they could enjoy it. So it creates this weird identity crisis in which you'll see people who are like, oh, I am, I'm going to, because I'm Sudanese. They'll be like, I'm Sudanese, but I'm not going to speak Arabic, right? I'm going to see, absolutely, it is the Oriental gaze, right? I'm Sudanese, but I'm not going to speak Arabic. Or I don't want to do the traditional things, or they'll do the traditional things when people tell them that it's actually pretty cool to do the traditional things. Like Mowahib said, henna was one of these things. I remember when I used to have henna in my hand and I'll pay for something, they'll be like, put it on the counter, because they don't want to touch my hand, because they didn't understand what was going on in my hand, like with all these drawings, and they felt creeped out. Sudanese people do henna on the fingers here. So I see it with my mom all the time. When she does it, they're like, what's wrong with your hand? Put it on the counter. Now it's perfectly normal, right? It's the cool thing to do. Everybody's doing it. Same thing with the fasting and all these pieces. And I think this is, and I agree with, I think it's Asmaa. I agree with her that we don't need that acceptance. But I also, in a way, I'm looking at all the negativity coming our way, is that we're becoming a lot more mainstream. People are running to a lot more Muslims. They're hearing a lot more about us. This is why it's causing such a ruckus, because they're just like, they don't know what it is, so they're scared. So there's this negative issues that are going on. And I think it's our part. We're not sitting here waiting for someone to be like, I love you, come in. It's our part to kind of carve our place and make our area be. This is where we are. And I think our sense of belonging starts with us. So when we become very clear of, I belong wherever it is that I am, and there's no one who's going to make me change my mind at all. And I am who I am and I belong here. I think these are the pieces that start swaying these ideas of like, well, I like you, but I don't like all of you. Well, too bad, take it or leave it. I'm a whole package kind of thing. It is very infuriating sometimes, especially when you hear Rumi things and you're like, do you know why he said this? Do you understand the context of what he's talking about here? But people don't care. So so these pieces, I think it comes back to us as in the community to start to seriously building that, not a character, but that sense of belonging and speaking with confidence that this is ours as much as it is anybody else's. Canada is mine as much as it is yours. So you yelling at me to go back where I came from doesn't work, because this is where I'm from. This is home. So we're going to have this conversation whether you like it or not. It's happening. So I think these are the moments when we really need to stand our ground as a community and be welcome. You don't have to be aggressive, right? We need to learn to call out as we call in, because we don't want to just call you out. We're going to call you out as we call you in. And then these are the things we need to work on as well.
Sawsan, do you want to add something briefly about accountability and any of the discussions we've had, just briefly, as we have to be conscious of time?
Yeah, so something that I didn't notice being brought up is the concept of people like monetizing our cultures, even though they're not from it. And like, that's really the whole reason why people, well, one of the reasons why people want the acknowledgement. Like I'm Sudanese. I used to wear henna, and I'd go to school, and I'd go to school like around Eid time, and I'd be wearing henna on my hand, and like people would be like, did you like draw on yourself with markers? Like, or like a teacher would be like reprimanding me like for drawing on myself, and I'm like, no, I didn't do that. And then meanwhile, you see people like at art festivals that aren't really knowledgeable of like what henna means in a lot of like cultures, and they just do like these weird designs, and they do like henna tattoos, and like I understand like being transformative and being an artist, but like, you know, when I see, I'm Sudanese, and when I see like a little kid with like henna on their foot, I'm like, oh, do you know that means that like you're married in in my family's culture? Like if you have henna on your foot, like that means that you're a woman. And yeah, like people don't understand the context. Also, people are like monetizing it. With the whole thing about copyright, like people think like for some reason minorities aren't really able to copyright their works. Like they're not able to copyright their designs, their whatever. Just because like oftentimes like people don't even have enough money to like trademark things. So people like these culture vultures, they like go in and then they like make it part of the mainstream.
Right.
And then like they completely take everything from it, and like whatever, they don't take the baggage of you. They don't accept you like with.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Sorry, I'm gonna have to cut you
bad.
because of time, Sawsan, but thank you so much. I'm gonna give each one of you a minute to go, and you're gonna go Asmaa, Hagir, Mowahib, then Sawsan. And I would like you to briefly for a minute tell me what you love the most about being Black, Muslim, and Canadian.
Okay, 1 minute's way too short, bro, but okay. So Fred Mouton, which is a Black philosopher and writer, he has this quote that I really love that I think explains it. So he said, anybody who thinks they can come even close to understanding how terrible the terror has been without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of that terror is wrong. There's no calculus of the terror that can make a proper calculation without reference to that which resists it. So I really love the liberation and revolutionary politics within Blackness and Islamic theology that really guides us and brings us from history to present and hopefully to futures yet unknown. So yeah, that's what I love.
I guess I'm next. I don't know how to follow that up. That was a great quote. That was a great call. I was like, all right, we're done. So Asma maybe should have went last. I think I absolutely agree. I think the beautiful thing about being a Black Muslim woman is this is who I am. This is the only I am ever going to be. And I think what happens is that I absolutely love the fact that I'm given a perspective of the world that is so multidimensional, that allows me to see and empathize in many different ways. And alhamdulillah, I'm blessed with a deen that allows me to manifest these understandings in so many different ways as well. So I think it's one of these areas in which, it's a blessing in disguise, in which all the obstacles that are faced only just make you stronger because they're only opportunities to make you grow. So this is what I love the most about it, is it allows me to see the world in so many different ways, and allows me to interpret it and also be able to help in many different ways and empathize. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Why?
Yes, I am very fortunate to come from a group of people who, even under very terrible situations, have managed to band together and persevere. And we've highlighted the difficulties related to our identity throughout this discussion, but I'm truly thankful for the way I have been created, alhamdulillah. And through the obstacles that I endure, I believe that my faith just gets stronger. And I think that's the most beautiful thing. And to me, being Black and Muslim is the harmony which enables me to understand, support, uplift every cause that is important to me. And that is what I like the most about my identity.
Thank you so much, Mowahib. And last but definitely not least, Sawsan.
Yeah, I totally agree with everyone that has went. I connect the most to what Mowahib said, the harmony of being me. Something that is referred to a lot in like Black literature is this idea of dual consciousness. So a lot of people were kind of separated between their Black or African identity and their North American identity or American identity. And I really enjoy that sense of like middleness, that liminality, because it allows me to open my heart and make sure that like, you know, I know what feeling bad is like. I know what being discriminated against is like, and I can see the world in like a different lens compared to a lot of other people that don't necessarily have my skin color or my experience.
Thank you guys so much for sharing. It's been such a great discussion. I really, really enjoyed it. And I feel as though I've learned so much about Canada as well in the different discussions that we've had. And I really am so grateful to Mona for bringing us together. I feel as though I've learned so much from you ladies. And just before I wrap up, I'd just like to call on Tiare to just give us some sort of wrap up and tell us what you caught from this discussion.
Hello. Wow. I learned so much listening to this conversation, and as you can see, I've made so many sticky notes as I am filling in, illustrating the diverse experiences that people have, but also the experiences that connect to each other across Blackness and across Muslimness. I'll tell you a little bit about the drawing. So here in the first corner, just expressing that part of people wanting to flatten one part of your identity to isolate another. And then I thought that the comment around being Black and Muslim is not new. Various stories of Black Muslims are in the Quran, and sort of acknowledging that like root of like, that root of belonging and of having always existed. And I thought that's a really powerful way to ground the rest of the poster, as the illustrations coming in here are acknowledging a lot of the discrimination and systemic racisms and fractions within that overlapping identity of Blackness and Muslimness. Here I've drawn a woman in a hijab being surrounded by people sort of just like all staring at her. And and someone had shared, just to sort of depict that hyper visibility. And then also here, this person in the Quebec context describing some of the difficulty of like having the discrimination against displays of religious symbols. And then I wanted to include some of the explanation of like feeling like then you have to prove your Muslimness in a space. And so that's a theme that will be reflected further in the poster here. As you can see, I'm still getting ready to draw some more images. Something that's to come is I wanted to also include an illustration based on the panelists and the like really inviting and curious space that you're holding here for each other to show that fullness of connection and sort of like amidst feeling perhaps like intense judgment or a dismissal of your Blackness or a dismissal of your Muslimness, to show the beauty of people connecting here in this space. So that will be some portraits based loosely on our fabulous panelists here. And then I also wanted to just say thank you for your parting comments on what you love about being Black and Muslim. I think that there's so much resonance and solidarity in what all of you have shared among each other. I'm excited to draw some of your quotes, especially expressing that harmony, that middleness, that liminality. I know that as a queer person of color, being both queer and a person of color, I also feel that, like someone expressed it as allowing my heart to open and have compassion for those who don't have my experience. And I think that that is such a strength that each of you bring in your unique experiences. And I want to thank you for sharing your whole selves here. And I hope that the illustration can catch up and reflect that spirit, even if I don't get every detail of your wonderful stories. So with that, I'll say, I know that we're up to near the end of our time, but if we don't have time for the full comments on any feedback of the image, I will say that when I send you the image, your feedback is welcome if there's something that needs to be changed to resonate more accurately.
All right, Tiara, thank you so much for joining us. And really, I'm so impressed by what you managed to do so far. I'm so curious to see how it's gonna end up. Thank you for listening to us and working at the same time while listening to us. And thank you to all these women who I'm so impressed by. To be honest, I really have learned so much from all of you, and I feel so connected to all of you. I also just want to brag that this is an all-girls panel and it's East African Fire killing it. You know, it doesn't matter where we are. Just bragging a bit, but also really, really proud and hopeful when I have these conversations with young women, and just with this sort of mindset, I just feel as though the future can only get better. And even if it doesn't, at least we have hope, right? And having said that, I'd like to call Mona back for our closing dua. And thank you all so much. My heart is so full. I've learned so much from all of you. And thank you, Tiara. Thank you so much for everything. Mona?
So, jazakumullah khairan for everybody for, where am I now? I should get Jazakumullah khairan for everybody who has tuned in from coast to coast to coast and beyond, because we know that Sabrina is not within our borders, but we're very grateful. I would like to say Jazakumullah khairan to Sister Sabrina Zahor, for she is 4 hours ahead of us in time, and she has spent a lot of time with respect to the advertising, the marketing, those beautiful posters that she just sort of whipped up, mashallah, that you saw of all the bios, and just putting so much time into this when she is always so much at a much later time during the day when we were meeting. With that, and also I'd like to say Jazakumullah khairan to all of our panelists. I echo what Sabrina said in terms of our appreciation, just being grateful for you for sharing your experiences here today with everyone. That's not an easy thing to do. And we do acknowledge that, inshallah. So with that, we should close. It's actually past Maghrib here in Eastern time zone. As I said, this is the grand finale, I could say, of Islamic History Month in Canada. And I'd like to say Jazakumullah khairan for everybody for participating in this and allowing us to have our first national event. Inshallah, that's something we can do going forward. So with that, I would like to close. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Assalamu alaikum, and we thank you all for joining, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Take care.